Word to the Wise. We are an explicit podcast tackling content with adult themes and whatnot. This month, we're talking about Brandon Sanderson's Tress of the Emerald Sea, and we'll undoubtedly touch on nearly everything up until the Lost Metal, excluding Stormlight, because I am a fresh-faced baby that has not read it yet.
Now, the last episode I listened to of your podcast, you hadn't read The Emperor's Soul.
That's
true
as well.
He also hasn't read The Emperor's Soul, which is what we were going to do originally here. Yeah.
I just want to make sure I have all the books that I don't want to spoil for you. Have you read Warbreaker?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I have read Warbreaker and Elantris. Otherwise, basically everything in the Mistborn series.
Okay.
Except for the very last set of chapters for the Lost Metal.
Yeah,
so
the last 6 chapters of the Lost Metal.
Yeah.
I'm still...
Oh my gosh.
We did the penultimate episode last night, so he's got the finale yet for this next week, but super close.
That's
I should have
awesome.
had you read that this morning.
I should have. Instead, I read the first 50 chapters of Tress again.
Anyway, we're going to do that. Welcome to Words and Whiskey Short Pours, a monthly podcast where we have a fun time discussing fictional worlds and the people that create them, all while boozing just a little bit. My name is Kross.
My name is PJ.
And I'm Peter.
And we are joined by Peter today, and it's so excited. We are here today to talk about the Cosmere and the first of the secret projects, Brandon Sanderson's Tress of the Emerald Sea. Peter, we're so excited to have you on the show.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we've been sort of planning something since Dragonsteel. It was originally going to be that Emperor's Soul, I think, but this lined up perfectly. So happy to talk about Tress.
You guys were right in front of me, or right behind me in the Sanderson signing line.
Yep.
It was fortuitous, and I'm glad we were able to connect.
Fast friends. It was great. Yeah, totally worked out.
Yeah.
Especially after
speaking of that, since we don't really have a drinking segment, I think all of us are drinking coffee or tea.
Morning AM episode.
Did you have a question for Brandon when you got up for him? And is it something that you can share?
I did not have a question for him because I had him sign 2 acrylic paintings I had done.
Okay.
That were like 3 feet or 4 feet by 2 feet.
Gotcha.
So it was mostly just, hey, please sign these paintings. And so I did not have a question prepared because I was too nervous about that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I saw you lugging those paintings around. That was cumbersome, but I'm glad it worked out.
It was. He said, and I don't think I'll ever feel a sense of joy, like disconnected from like having kids and getting married, as when I showed him the painting, he said, oh my God, that's the painting from Warbreaker, isn't it? That looks exactly how I imagined it in my head when writing the book.
That's awesome. That's so cool.
Yeah, that's amazing.
What about you guys? Did you have questions for him?
I asked him about Wayne and whether or not his ability to imitate people was somehow magical. And his answer was that it's not. He just generally gets an edge on things being an Allomancer.
So like he's a little bit better because of that.
Cool.
And I had a couple of questions, but like the entire concept of this many people waiting in a line to ask him, nerdy questions about whatever in the world. I was like, man, I know you played Elden Ring. What's your favorite moment of game design and your least favorite? And like, just tell me what's up. What'd you think? What would you like? What didn't you like? And he was like, I loved, and went off on a couple of different things, but he was like, I despised Melania, but that's because I forced myself to be under-leveled. I would have beaten it if it weren't, but I spent way too much time there. And I was like, that's reasonable. And his favorite was the series of the white sheep bosses. I forget what they were called, but basically just the apostles, I think. I forget what they're called. Anyway, point being, preferred that because it was gradually introducing mechanics to you throughout the game and then culminating in like almost a final boss fight version of them right before kind of the Elden Ring fight. So it's cool. I was like, sweet. And, he got really into it, which I think was something like he's, of course, very into his stories and everything else. But it was nice I kind of wanted to just like give him something for like sitting there and, torturing himself for us. So
it gives a different energy.
Yeah,
that's very kind of you.
I also wanted to know, so it was a legit moment too. Like I got my question answered, but at the same time, it was I didn't want to ask. I also, in front of PJ, didn't want to ask something like nerdy about Stormlight, and like potentially ruin something there. So that was my other side of things.
To have remembered, like we know this about me. I'm so bad at remembering things.
I don't know. That's a moment that I won't forget, though. It's just meeting Brandon Sanderson in general. It was very cool. And obviously, Peter, we also met you. That's a big deal inside of our Dragonsteel experience. So,
yeah. I got to tell you guys, because you recognized me. You were like, you're Cosmere Considered, aren't you? And I was like, what is happening in my life right now? Someone knows who I am. I was so unprepared. And I had like 2 or 3 other people that weekend, and they were like, hey, you're from TikTok, right? And I was like, oh, yeah. I am going to go have a little breakdown because I was not emotionally ready for this. So give me a minute.
But unfortunately, you didn't have the space to go leave the line, so you were stuck with us.
We trapped you.
Yeah. It's one of those things, too, where like we don't put our faces out there at all. The podcast, of course, at present, at the very least, we don't do reels or anything like that. But we had a couple of people that came up to us because we recorded a live show there, and we're like, it's honestly like it is so humbling and like mind-blowingly cool when people are like, I love what you do, and it's like, oh, I'm just a little nerd and I'm a fan of this guy like you are, like so good. So I feel that. I empathize with the experience that we gave you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, I think kind of a fun thing to lead into this before we start talking about Tress itself, I would love to hear how you found or got to the Cosmere, kind of your origin story of sorts with Brandon Sanderson and the Cosmere.
So I was reading Hyperion, which is an award-winning sci-fi book. And I read the first third of it. And it's really interesting. Like the first third was like just consumed my thoughts. And I got to the second part of it. And the second act of Hyperion, spoilers, is basically just about a guy trying to find the woman that he's had sex with in his dreams. And that's like the driving force of his story. And I just was like, no. I was like, this is sad to me that this is award winning because what is even happening? So I thought, okay, I'm going to go back to my old standby. And I looked up Orson Scott Card because I had read his books in high school and found out that he basically been canceled for being transphobic. And I was like, well, maybe I won't go buy some of his new books because that's political and I don't want to get involved in that. And then because I had looked up Orson Scott Card, I got a offer from Amazon that was get The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance for 1 Audible credit instead of 2. And I was like,
what?
I grabbed it. I grabbed it. And I was like, this guy's a Mormon author. This is perfect. And I listened to both of those books. And I was like, this is great. And then I met up with a friend. And he was like, hey, I just finished reading this book called Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. And I was like, I just finished reading these books. And so we swapped. I gave him my login. He gave me his login. And we listened to. And then we were like, oh, my God. It's like the Avengers. It's the same universe. And then we started a podcast about it. And since then, I've just hyperfixated on the Cosmere. So, it's most of my personality, almost. So,
hey, that's totally reasonable.
Yeah,
gotta devote to something. I feel that.
Awesome. Question. Oh, so first was Way of Kings, Words of Radiance, then Mistborn. Then where'd you go from there? Did you follow any specific order of reading, or was it just kind of whatever?
That's also helpful.
Oh, that was the deal that happened when Words of Radiance came out.
Okay, got it.
I got into it when Words of Radiance came out. I think I finished the first Mistborn trilogy, went back and read Elantris, and then it was just kind of as things were published, I think at that point. Because I grabbed Arcanum Unbounded, I have the first 3 parts, 3 of 4 White Sand comic books.
Oh.
So I actually don't know how that story ends. I only know the setup. I'm waiting on my omnibus,
Mhm.
but yeah, I unfortunately haven't finished that one. But everything else I have read. And actually, this might surprise you. My favorite Sanderson book is
Mm.
Legion,
Yep.
which I just am a big fan of. I think it's because it reads like a movie starring Morgan Freeman as like one of the main characters. So that's probably why.
I got that as a gift from a fan recently of our show, and I am very, very excited to give it a read because I haven't yet, and it was his favorite read of last year, so pumped.
It's fun. I hope you like it.
Yeah, I'm excited because it seems like it's right up my alley, given the descriptions and everything else that I'd read. You know, the synopsis on the back and kind of the novella style of storytelling as well, is I always love. So I'm a fan in concept for sure. Since we're on the topic of the favorite Brandon Sanderson novels, what is your favorite? What's your standout? If you had to pick one.
It's so hard because it's for different reasons.
Sure.
Because like Warbreaker is probably my favorite book just for the twists. I know even on rereads, I'm like, oh God, I forgot. So I love Warbreaker for that. Words of Radiance is my favorite for the politics and the villains in that book. The Alloy of Law is my favorite reread because it just feels like Sherlock Holmes and the X-Men in turn of the century New York. And I just love that. Like, it's just, I still remember the first time listening to the audiobook when he's at the wedding party and he's like, the doors at both ends of the hall burst open. And then it's just like a 20-page chapter of shooting guns. And I was like, this is incredible. I need more guns in this man's writing repertoire because he writes gun scenes very well.
It's true.
And now my favorite reread is Tress of the Emerald Sea.
Hell yeah. Could not have asked for a better transition into talking about the book itself. So I am so excited to do that. So before we go into overall kind of like thoughts on this, I would love to start off with just a little summary for people who may not have read it yet. So I'm just going to read the summary that's straight up from Amazon, from Dragonsteel themselves. So
I'm going to stop you right there. If you haven't read it yet, read it. You should read it. I mean, you're welcome to listen to this anyway, but
go read it.
It's so good.
It's really good. It's really good. Fair point. So the summary, again, for those who may need a refresher, although you shouldn't because it's only been out for a month, so it should be fresh in your brain hole when you were reading this. That's neither here nor there. The only life Tress has known on her island home in an emerald green ocean has been a simple one, with the simple pleasures of collecting cups brought by sailors from faraway lands and listening to stories told by her friend Charlie. But when his father takes him on a voyage to find a bride and disaster strikes, Tress must stow away on a ship and seek the sorceress of the deadly midnight sea. Amid the spore oceans where pirates abound, can Tress leave her simple life behind and make her own place sailing a sea where a single drop of water can mean instant death? Provided to you by best-selling author Brandon Sanderson. The Tress in the Emerald Sea. You would imagine that tagline like right after it, but there isn't one. Yeah, exactly. There's your movie trailer. How do we feel about this book overall? Peter loves it, so
I love it.
PJ loves it. I loved it.
I think it's my favorite Brandon Sanderson book so far.
Wow.
I really, really
That's
love
awesome. Brandon Sanderson suggests reading like Going Postal by Terry Pratchett, if you've never read Pratchett. And I got like, it's so funny and it reads so well. And then reading this, it was very clear how he tried to capture some of that Pratchett humor. And it works so well. It's so funny and just really well written. I love it.
Yeah. Terry Pratchett is definitely one of the primary. There are a couple of what I would say are like primary inspirations for this novel. Of course, like The Princess Bride itself is like a foundational thing. And the original sort of text that accompanies it being, you know, the actual book itself being a big inspiration beyond just the movie. It feels very reminiscent in those ways. But I think Pratchett is maybe the number one source of humor and that sort of fantasy comedy that just like there are few that nail as effortlessly. I don't think that there's anyone that nails it as effortlessly as Pratchett did. But yeah, I think he does a great job wrapping that into Hoyd's character and making him feel very interesting. I loved the book up until the last 6 chapters, and then I liked the book. And so that's why I think like I'm always gonna have Warbreaker higher in my head, but this is right there in the top like 5. This is a wonderful story, and I restarted it this morning just to listen to the first couple of chapters again, and was like, damn it, this is so enrapturing. Like, it's wonderfully written.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll come back to this later, but I have a theory on why this planet and why this story. But we can come back to that in a bit.
Yeah. It feels like there are some very clear, like, I mean, there's some very obvious connections. I haven't read Pratchett, so I can't speak to that one, but the Princess Bride is explicitly stated in the postscript, but even without it, it's pretty clear that was, like, I think within the first couple chapters, Crossland texted me, he's like, this feels like the Princess Bride, very excitedly. Mm-hmm. I liken it to The Hobbit. I just the pacing of it and the way all the like chapters are broken up into these little contained chunks just feels very similar, which I love. I don't know. I feel great about it.
I agree. Like when I read that note, when you were like, it sounds like The Hobbit, I was like, yeah, it's like Tress there and back again. Like it has that very same vibe for sure.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'd be curious if he took any inspiration from that directly or indirectly.
It definitely carries that prequel kind of weight almost, where it's like, it's long and it's not long for Sanderson, but it's a longer book, but it definitely has that feel of like, there's another story after this one, like the story that's about the pirate captain. And this is the prequel. I don't know, which is one of the reasons that for me, the ending is a little sad, not sad, but a little less. Like you said, the last 6 chapters, I liked it. And it's like, well, yeah, she spent the entire book learning all these things, gaining all this knowledge, and then she didn't use it. And the book ended.
Yes. Yeah. That's actually honestly probably a fair point, because it is, the solution kind of comes out of left field as opposed to her utilizing that information. I hadn't pinned it that closely, but that is probably why the tech reveal for me didn't hit nearly as hard, where I was just like, oh, okay, like all these different things, like that's fine. I know that's where the universe is going, but it kind of bummed me out because it felt like Tress wasn't doing her thing, if that made sense. And I think you nailed it. I think that's why. So we can button up this podcast right now. That's all I wanted to talk about. We'll see you next week. We're gonna I'm just kidding. Yeah, no, I'm totally with you on that. I think to that point, on the exploration side of the story, right, there is this beautiful world, of course. I mean, it wouldn't be Brandon Sanderson if it weren't an incredible world where we have fluidization of these like solid oceans that feel like liquid. It's wonderful. And the aethers finally being explored, and the spores. Yeah, I mean, what do we think of the magic of this story and how that's captured? I don't know.
I loved it.
Yeah. It's unique, and it's well established and well thought up. It's so much fun, but consistent across all the different types of ethers, different types of spores. Like it maintains a consistency of mechanics while having wildly different effects, and it creates this really, really cool mosaic of magic within this system.
Yes. Yeah, I love the magic. It made me want more.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know about all the aethers and all the seas. I want the world building of that planet, just so I can know about that, because it was just so interesting.
Yeah. I definitely had a similar kind of moment when I was listening to the story. It will forever be very funny to me. Jay, we were in the middle of the Lost Metal, and we were just getting introduced to Twin Soul, and at the same time as this book came out. And so PJ suddenly had information on the aethers that I didn't have when I read The Lost Metal. And I was like, that is so funny, because you should know fucking nothing like the rest of us did. But you don't, because of this like incredibly well-timed release that just like gave you the answers to things. And I was like, God damn it. How convenient for you. It was very well done. So I just, there was a little geek out moment that I had around the aethers as well. And it's maybe the geekiest moment that I've had since like reading Stormlight for the most part. But Hoyd makes mention at some point of the Luhil bond, right? And we talk about sort of the relationship there. We know as well from that description, PJ doesn't actually know what this is, but he does mention the Nahil bond being of the bond of the mind. And you can imagine the same thing, the Luhil bond being a bond of the body is the way that it's described. So naturally, knowing Brandon's 3-realm theory and like the whole realmatic system, that means that there's this third bond out there that has to be a spirit bond of some kind, and I must know more.
I thought the Nile bond was the spirit bond.
I think it's mind, but I'll double check real quick. But either way, that does leave it either leaves the mind or the spirit open yet for a bond to be described.
If the spirit one is still open, could that be encapsulated by hemalurgy?
No. Well,
okay.
No. Not to the same degree that you're suggesting.
Okay.
So we know the 2 bonds we know about. This isn't super spoilery. I'm going to think about it for a sec. Yeah, it's not. So the 2 bonds we know about predate the shattering.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Which means the 3rd one should as well. So who knows? Maybe it has to do with dragons. I don't know.
Good. I do like that dragons exist now, and maybe they didn't otherwise, but I haven't seen any.
How did you feel? That's skipping ahead, but I am curious how you felt about the dragon's appearance.
I don't recall the description.
He's black with like pearlescent outlining almost, and he has a beard. Also like a mane on his head. And like dragons with hair have always thrown me off. So I was like, oh, no, a dragon with hair. But I'll trust Brandon to...
A hairy dragon.
So that's more in the stylings of the sort of serpentine Chinese mythologies, right?
Well, I think he said in an interview once, he said that he always pictures the dragons from Earthsea, Tales of Earthsea, as his dragons in his head because he grew up with those, I think is what he said. So that might be... I think those have beards.
Gotcha.
They are European dragons. They do have 4 legs and the big wings and stuff.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't really dwell on it on the description. I also listen at like 2.5x speed most of the time, just because Michael Kramer talks so slowly throughout these books, and I can get through 2 listens in the same amount of time as listening to it once, which is kind of necessary for our show. So that dragon scene goes pretty quickly. It's basically one chapter, and so it didn't dwell on it, so I didn't dwell on it. But that does feel fairly unique compared to like what I've experienced as far as depictions of dragons go. I'm down with it though. I think that's pretty cool. Mullet dragon, basically.
Yeah,
mullet dragon. So another point. Obviously, we don't have the physical books yet, but if in a PJ, I'm assuming you haven't seen them. Did you look for at the art for the book and the dragon? Did you guys look at the Kindle EPUB? Oh man, I kind of like the depiction in the art of the hair. Like generally, I'm with you. I don't like the idea of a hairy dragon, but it feels somewhere in between a lot of things. It almost has a more Celtic sort of spin to it that I'm okay with in addition to the rest. I did want to clarify. So textually, here's the wording from Hoyd in this book. So the Nahil bond, which trades in consciousness and anchoring to reality. The Luhil bond trades in physical matter. So I think that's got to be the second, and I think we're still missing spiritual.
Yep.
Yeah, so... But point being, I mean, that doesn't change the context of what we were talking about. So it's just interesting. It's my nerd bit. So.
No, I love that. I'm excited. Yeah. I hadn't even considered that. So I'm excited to think about that.
There's my crazy theory. There's a third one somewhere. We don't know. We don't know what it is yet. But it's out there.
Nah, he's just going to let that one float. If there's anything that Brandon Sanderson is, it's complete.
I mean, none of the stories are finished yet, so we don't.
There's proof.
Yeah. Or
back up my claim.
I personally, okay, so since we're talking about the dragon, I think that reveal in that moment with Crow is really interesting. We can talk about Crow for sure. What do we make of the whole dragon scene and sequence and this idea of him being kind of under the ground and studying, basically on the ocean floor? What'd you guys make of the dragon itself outside of the physical depiction?
I felt like it created this really cool play on the idea of a horde being knowledge and what's it called? Research, basically. And he's bargaining for research subjects, more or less. So I felt like that maintained the traditional like idea of dragons hoarding things without it just being treasure, which felt cool. I mean, there are different dragons that deal in different treasures. We've dealt with one in our D&D campaign that acts fairly similarly.
Go listen to Tales of Kana, Catacomb Party.
Yeah, but I liked that, and the setting, the layer, if you will, being at the bottom of the sea is really cool and weird and treacherous, but perfect for a dragon's lair if they're able to sustain themselves there. So I felt like it just fit really, really well within that setting.
And I loved that he felt almost human with his, like, he gets amused at their squabbling when she's like, I have brought you this one. And then Tress is like, I have brought you this one. And the dragon's like, this is funny. Keep talking. I just love that. Because I feel like often dragons are like Smaug, who are like, all they care about is like violence and their horde. And this dragon is like, this is fun. Let's have a chit chat. And
let's let this.
And also, I like that he's like, listen, I treat my slaves really well. Like, you get to read books when you're not working. It's a nice life down here. You guys get to talk and hang out. You never get to see the sun again, but that's okay.
Yeah, exactly. There is a sort of almost comedy to a lot of the way that he plays off, like the whole book, right? And so that's why it works so well. And I love Zixis for that reason. I think he also says something that he's like, I prefer not to call them slaves. I prefer to call them patrons or something like that. I can't remember what the word was that was used, but it absolutely was perfect.
Yes.
Yeah. It also reminded me, again, if we're talking about Princess Bride parallels, with Crow and Tress in this moment, of the same sort of scene with Vizzini and like the sort of trickery of like marching back and forth. And it has that same feel, but it's not a clone at all. Like it's that same sort of trick in a fable or a story like this. And I loved that about it.
That's awesome.
So we are so far ahead, but that's kind of the name of the game. We don't follow any kind of order in the show. And if you're not along for that ride, you're along for it right now because you're listening anyway. So I guess we maybe should start at the beginning with, at the very least, like a small little bit here on sort of the initial prospect of Tress as a character, collector of cups, quaint town that she's from, kind of in love with the groundskeeper, not groundskeeper, King's son, Charlie. What do we make of the initial premise of the story and the way that this opens on the Emerald Sea?
I love that it just feels like one big trope. Like it hits like 7 tropes in the first few chapters, and then it shatters all, like, and like even all the tropes it sets up, it breaks down at the end of each setup, because she's like, I think I'll be content to stay on this island for the rest of my life. And you're like, that's not what an adventurer says. And like, that's how it breaks down every trope, is like, just her as a person is not the person to be in that trope. And I just love it. She feels exactly like I want a hero to feel like, because I love all of Sanderson's heroes, but they all have something that like bugs me at least a little bit about them. And for Tress, the thing that bugs me is that I don't have more of her yet.
I just more, please. Can I?
Yeah.
Another book.
And I think, kind of to piggyback off of that a little bit, just the amount of tropiness throughout the whole thing, but paired with how hard it leans into it, The fact that they all get broken down, like you mentioned, but also that it's self-aware of them. And maybe that's a function of being narrated by Hoyd, but like it is so self-aware of these tropes, and I think that's why it works so well somehow. Yeah, I adored just the storybook opening of all of this. It felt so good.
Yeah, it feels it, and I love that it is intentionally layering those tropes on. I think a lot of people, for the record, this is more of a general thing. I'm talking about this tomorrow with another friend to record a show, but I think that a lot of people view tropes as a bad thing. It's really just a lens through which we experience stories that we already understand. Like, that's not a bad thing necessarily. It is a guidepost. It's an expectation. And there's nothing wrong with a little bit of expectation when you're kind of setting yourself up, because it sets up everything else. And in this story that is layered with these tropes upon tropes upon tropes, we also get this wonderful description that, like, Tress is just so delightfully normal and just so, like, delightfully average. And, like, that's kind of the idea of, like, where she is in life. And that the fact that she is normal is, like, a core crutch of the whole story, because you can approach things with a very, very different mindset if you aren't full of ego and all of these other things. And that being her superpower, I think, is delightful throughout the entire story.
Yes, Hoyd's insight throughout the story of him, like, every time he pauses in the telling to talk about her as a person, is like, it reinforces how normal and yet special she is, which just deepens her character. And I love that.
Yeah. We got to talk about Hoyd as a narrator. I think we made the comparison. You made the comparison earlier, Peter, to, of course, Terry Pratchett. And I think that's definitely apparent. But this is the first long story, I guess, that PJ has probably experienced from Hoyd in any regard. Given there is, of course, the story in Warbreaker that is narrated inside of that one chapter. But I think outside of that, this is like the first long form experience that any of us have really had with Hoyd. It's longer than, pages. So what do we make of this master story crafter, this world bringer, telling us the story?
He's fun. I like him.
That is good to hear. I'm excited to hear from you in several podcast episodes when you read some more books.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I love his energy. I love how he, like, when he pauses and takes those breaks, they feel very much like he is talking to, from our point of view, someone who is, like, bound and gagged. Like, it feels like he's telling the story to, like, a prisoner on their way to execution or something.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, they're not allowed to talk or something. And he's just like, yeah, here's this really long story that I'll tell you while we're both on our way to be executed, but I won't die, but you might. And like, it just fits so well. And I'm so excited. I don't know when it'll happen, but in a few books, I'm sure we will be, like, reading a chapter and he'll be like, have I ever told you of Tress of the Emerald Sea? And, like, it'll cut chapters. And then, a few chapters later, that story will, like, come up, like, peripherally as having been told. And we'll be like, we know who he told this story to now.
And it takes 12 hours. The story takes 12 hours. Like, you're totally right. That's totally going to happen. There's no doubt in my mind.
Oh, that'd be super. A super cool nesting of storytelling.
Mm-hmm. I similarly am very curious to whom the story is being narrated to, right? Like, who is this person bound and gagged, in the moment? And given we have timing context, but we have no other context outside of that. So I'm very intrigued where he's sitting telling the story, to whom, from what world they're from. He says at different points that, like, your world has these things, you would understand them as this. And so that constantly gives me little flags that I'm just trying to understand.
Have you read Sixth of the Dusk?
Nope.
I don't think he has. There's a good chance that it's there, though.
Yeah, it's a short story, but I think that someone from that world is the one being narrated to because of a few different things he says, talking about trappers, and he uses a few different words that are from that story. Mm-hmm. So I think maybe it's someone from that land, but and we don't actually know where in the timeline Tress is. It feels like it's in the future from like the main Cosmere storyline. But
yes. Yeah. I think that, we can kind of imply by the end of the story with the reveal of different technologies and components there that we are well past where we are in present. And we are at the very least on the edge of space travel, which is pre-Mistborn Era 4, it seems. So that's where my brain goes. Is it somewhere maybe post Era 3 when Warbreaker 2 takes place? Like we don't really know. I think it's maybe the latest entry. Sixth Dusk could still be later than it in theory, but I think one of those two are contending for the latest spot in the Cosmere right now.
Yeah, I agree.
Just to add a little bit more information or context potentially for who Hoyd's talking to, it felt to me like there was an audience as opposed to a singular person, because of a couple comments where he talks about like the normality, like the normal points of this world. And he said it's as normal as this or something else, wherever you're, like whatever world you might be from. So it sounds like he's either talking to multiple people or somebody he doesn't necessarily know the origin of.
I would love if he is just like saying this whole story to a group of Kelsier and his friends. Just like,
yeah,
that would fit. Ghost Bloods. Yeah,
that would fit. Also, because of the use of the name Sazed as opposed to Harmony.
Yeah, that is a whole bucket of worms. Yeah.
Nice. I missed that. That is that's smart.
I don't know. Don't know how to feel about that.
Did you guys catch, because I missed this on my first read, but on my second read, I know I'm gonna jump to the end of the book now because I'm terrible at chronological order.
So are we.
But the sorceress is from Mistborn Secret History.
Yes.
Did you guys catch that? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Rena, right? I believe.
Rina.
Yeah.
The audio Rina, which
makes sense with the Elantrian language and the way that those break up into single syllable bits to. Yeah.
I loved like that tiny connection. Like, cause all of the Cosmere world hopping connections are so fun. But then like little things like that where like you have to have read what is most likely one of the most obscure Cosmere novellas to understand who the sorceress is and like what she's a part of. Which is interesting that she's alone now because she was a part of Irie or the Icery or whatever it's called. And now she's alone in a rocket ship on an island on a planet that is created or controlled by Whimsy.
Yeah, one is not sure. Whimsy is mentioned enough times for it to be like okay. All right. And the word whimsy is capitalized too many times for this to be a fucking coincidence.
Yes. And Brandon mentioned whimsy in like the Kickstarter videos when he talked about this one. And so like we know that she's part of it, but like also, yeah, there was a few points where the capital whimsy was mentioned. And I was like, oh man, that's some sneaky Brandon.
I think that the fact that it is whimsy, I kind of want to go on this tangent and then I'll return to the Rhina thing. I think that the fact that we assume that there is some direct connection with whimsy being it maybe the Shard World or maybe not the Shard World, maybe it was just there for a while. Specifically the way that the rain is its own sort of depiction of whimsy, right? Like it's this idea of like, yeah, I'm very consistent until I want to be interesting. And then on the Crimson Sea is when he's like, yeah, this is the interesting rain. This is where we can just do whatever the hell we want for the sake of, and I think that that's kind of the vibe that I get, or one of the things that tips me off to believing that this world was invested by whimsy or was created maybe with whimsy, or whimsy was there to begin with. There's some touch point of whimsy in this, and I'm very confident because of the rain specifically was the thing that made me feel that.
Yeah.
I only listened to the audiobook, so I didn't realize there were capital letters.
Wow. You would do that. Way to go, PJ. We clean the audio too, so don't worry about coughing or anything like that. We got you. But yeah, I really enjoyed kind of the I loved how like Cosmere aware the story was, but like how unobtrusive it was to the storytelling at the same time. It was all like there all the time, and it was mentioned and made mention of by Hoyd, and it danced around in fun way. And I think that's another part of the reason that I feel like just a little robbed by the ending with the tech reveal. And, you know, a big part of that, of course, like you said earlier, being Tress's character moment. Just even the throwing around the term laptop, given the context of the rest of the story, and tablet for me was just like, I don't love that, but I understand why you're doing it. Works because it's Hoyd, but at the same time, it didn't work for my brain because you're gelling in one chamber of the story, and then all of a sudden you're jumping and making technological leaps. And yeah.
The word laptop I am frustrated with, because I think a lot of things have Earth names on Scadrial. That's a big thing, is that it's an Earth, parallel planet. But laptop feels like such a modern word that it kicks me out of the book completely.
100%.
I had to pause the book. I had to take a second, laptop, what is happening? And before going back into it.
Before getting to the laptop part, when talking about the tablets, he refers to that as Nelthian tech, I believe.
It's a Warbreaker.
Yeah, so I'd assume the laptop would be part of that as well, but
yeah, no, you're right, because they have awakened circuitry, he says. So, which is interesting that all seemingly because hold on, spoilers.
Yeah, I know.
So while you're thinking about that, he does give another name for the laptop before, not correcting himself, but giving that alternate name, seemingly as throwing a bone to the audience of whoever he's talking to, if it's us or if it's somebody within the Cosmere or whatever. But he seems to be aware that there are different names for it.
He doesn't call it anything differently. What he says is, so the woman herself sat at her desk near the bookshelves holding a fluffy white cat and idly doing something on her laptop. Or, her magical seeing board, in quotations.
Gotcha.
And that is...
Okay.
That is what took me out of the story, because it's like, okay, you understand that this is enough to be a joke, and that's why I was like, this is playing, all of Hoyd's humor lands for the most part for most of the story, and that is a joke, but at the same time it's so disingenuous, and it's a point of friction for me in this story, and it's so silly because it's one paragraph, but
yeah, and I the whole time when we Fort has his writing board, his listening board. In my head, I was picturing a wooden plank that formed magic words on it. I was picturing complete magic.
Etch a sketch for me.
That he's holding an iPad at the end of it. I was like, oh, that's sad. that's just an iPad and not awakened wood or something.
Yeah, right. I imagine a small chalkboard that the words appeared on.
Yeah. But yeah, and it is that it robs some of the magic of the story, some of that sort of the whimsical nature of the whole thing, and this fact that this feels kind of like a fable. It just kind of takes the wind out of it at the 11th hour too, which is just kind of like a damn it. It would have been fine if this were explained in a different story, or we came to understand, let's say Warbreaker 2 skips forward a million years. I don't know how long, really. I'm just using a million as the placeholder, but it skips forward to the point of where this is commonplace and it's technology or whatever. We could go, oh, the tablet that Fort has is the thing that Fort is using is a tablet. Duh. Okay. Got it. That's different than telling us in the story, what it is, and kind of, I robbing the magic to some degree. I don't know. But that is kind of the name of the game with later Cosmere, though. As we're starting to approach that, is it's going to become a little bit less, and it's gradually becoming a little bit less whimsical and more science. And so while it's still a very cool expression of these things, that is truly, if you want to embody my concern for the back half of the Cosmere, that is it. It's losing this sort of intangibility of this all and having it be so defined that it's just cool execution of ideas as opposed to something that inspires awe. And that's my only concern. My general fear. Yeah.
And I think that very fear, I hope Brandon is aware of it, because it feels like things like the Aethers and whatever the third type of bond is are the things that are going to hold that whimsy. Because like the Aethers don't feel, I mean, they obviously have rules for how they operate. We learn that in the book, but they feel beyond the ideas of technology in a way. Like even early on in like the first Mistborn books, because I knew he was like, I want to get to the space age with this. I was like, okay, yeah, I can see how this could work in a space age. And with the Aethers, I'm like, I do not see how growing crystal will work in a space age or growing twins. And it just feels very different in that sense. So I hope that can contain some of the whimsy as we get more into that life.
That makes sense. Yeah. And I wouldn't place the blame on Sanderson. I just think that is the delicate line to walk. And I think that this story was walking it for so long, and then it just veered the other direction. And that was just a little bit too much of a veer for me away from that, as it felt like it kind of came out of left field. And it makes sense. That's the other side of this, is that like, I'm not mad because it doesn't function in the story. It totally does. It totally works. And I'm also not mad to begin with, but I was just kind of like, shucks, I kind of liked the way that this was going before this moment.
Yeah.
But yeah. We should talk about the other characters. I know that we've been all over the Cosmere roadmap, and I love that about this show. But I would love to chat just about the crew in general, the asshole father, the wonderful parents that Tress has, which is also a first for Brandon to have a loving dad in his story. Wow, crazy! What a concept. What do we make of our cast of characters? I mean, the Dougs. Anyway,
I love it. I love all of it. One of the things I noticed about a comment on the talk I posted was that there are no separated, previously married couples in the Cosmere until the end of this book, when the Duchess leaves the Duke for abandoning their child, which I thought was really cool to throw that in there, where she was like, "That's a line." But then I think like the portrayal of the Dougs is hilarious, but I love Fort and Anne are both great characters.
Yeah, Tress's parents are so good. And like there's so many complicated heartstrings that are being pulled between like her kind of taking lead on feeding the family and being like worried about how they're going to get on when she leaves. The sort of logical map that her father takes to like say, yeah, that makes sense that you should go because you've been so logical and you've clearly thought out every other possibility. So like, who am I to stop you from doing this? The advanced fathering scene where he goes to the bar and doesn't ask for help, but brings up all the things he's done for everybody. And like, that's just kind of the name of the game in this community of like trading in favors. The dart scene was fucking hilarious.
So great.
Shooting at the knots in the wood.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love her father and everything that he does for her, and the leaps he goes to support her in this adventure. It's great.
I have this small thing with Fort, right? And I know that I think that we know that he's from Lumar, but there's just this undertone of, I actually can't talk about that because PJ hasn't finished Lost Metal yet.
But I know exactly what you're not saying. I have the same thought.
Yeah. Okay. All right. As long as you're on the same page as me.
Love you guys.
You're so close to the end too that it's just like, damn it. Oh God, I want to talk about it. But I'm gonna leave that there. I love Fort as a character. I love Soleil. I really enjoy the crew. Anne is wonderful, and also the way that the crew generally like gradually shifts in favor of Tress, I think is fantastic over the course of the story, as she just kind of wins them over by being herself. I think that's one of the things that's wonderful about her, is that like she just continues to be who she is, and that everyone gravitates towards that because she's very honest and real about what she's presenting to everyone. So so good, so sweet, so wholesome.
And that energy that she brings and the whole crew loves. And that being the final thing where like Pro is like, well, I'm definitely going to give you to the dragon because the crew loves you.
Mhm.
Because like in my mind, part of her is like, it's more useful to have a Sprouter on board than Laggart, even though Laggart is very cowed. Like, I think in my head, Crow was like, maybe I'll give Laggart to the dragon still.
Mhm.
But then she wins the crew's love. And she's like, well, now that you've saved the ship and everyone loves you, I have to kill you. Like,
Yeah.
just
I have no choice.
the evilness of that character loved her as a villain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Going off of that some more between all of these characters and the Dogs as a whole, just the crew entirely getting on her side and being won over made for another potential reference point or inspiration point. I don't know if it's true, but it just felt so similar and it felt so good. But have you seen Our Flag Means Death yet?
I have not. I watched the trailer because I saw it in the notes.
Good.
And I love Rhys Darby. Is that his name?
Yep.
The main character. That he's so funny.
Yeah.
I want to watch it now that I've seen the trailer.
Yeah, it is so good, but just this wholesome pirate crew that aren't really exactly what they need to be yet, but the morale of the ship kind of brings them in line, and it's very different from a standard pirate crew, like pirate ship by the end of it all. But it felt very similar to this crew dynamic. I don't know if you felt the same way, Crossland, but
I totally did. So I hadn't really considered that way. It is definitely, in context, and this isn't, we won't go into Our Flag Means Death spoilers by any stretch, but in pirate that shouldn't be a pirate, right, is kind of the whole idea of the story, but he wants to be so badly. And like getting a pirate crew to like rally around your like weird morality of like, well, I don't know that we should kill them. And like, okay, well, and then gradually winning them all over is very much the same energy that Tress has throughout the story. And they do float along similar parallels, even the fact that they're pirate ships to begin with. I think the writing of the story does predate the release of Our Flag Means Death, regardless, but it is a parallel nonetheless because of when, in 2020 he wrote it. So,
right. That makes sense.
But
maybe it's just that it's on a pirate ship and it's unconventional, so it reminded me of it.
I mean, it's also similar to the winning over of Fezzik and Inigo Montoya, right? The same kind of way where they're like won over because of the acts of Wesley. Wow, I pulled all those names out of a distant pocket of my brain. But yeah, Crow. Speaking of Crow is, I think I can stand by this. I think Crow is my favorite Cosmere villain in a ton of different ways. I think that it's because she is so relatable and very real. Like, her goal is to cure her cancer effectively, and like that's her mission. And she goes through it by maniacal and manipulative means, of course, because that's the only path that she can see to actually getting people to commit to this insane act of going to the Emerald Sea. Not the Emerald Sea, the Crimson Sea. And so I think that just makes her an incredibly compelling character because she is much more morally gray than most of Sanderson's villains. Because ultimately she doesn't have the desire to kill people. She just sees it as a means to the ends of solving her problem.
Yeah.
Makes for a nice, complex, juicy bit to jump into.
And I don't know if he's done this in other stories, but it was interesting to learn that because Ulam says it's painful. It's very painful to be a spore eater. And so I'm like very curious, because I've known a few people that have chronic pain who, on a scale of 1 to 10, they're at a 7 most days. And like, some of them have been very kind and very nice, but some of them they're just bitter and they're just hurting. And so of course they're grumpy and upset 90% of their life, because how could you not be when you're in constant pain? And how that's a very real in that sense. And I know that that's not true for everybody who has chronic pain, but I think that kind of honesty from that character was very interesting to me. And of course she also I'm sure she was, raised by terrible parents, because it says she had never known love. Like, she has a whole host of issues that aren't her chronic pain and her poisonous spores, but it was cool to kind of see that in the Cosmere.
Yeah.
While I agree with you, Crossland, I do want to push back a little bit on the note about it being more morally gray, because it's a means to the end for herself. There's no like overarching, like, yes, I'm killing people, but ultimately it'll save a lot more in the future. Like, that feels more morally gray than selfishness.
You're right.
You know,
what I'm trying to get at, I guess, is that I think that a lot of Brandon Sanderson's other villains are very strictly black. You know, like Straff is an asshole, is a deliberate piece of shit for all kinds of reasons, and similarly has a lot of those same traits. She's got a little bit of gray, but I don't think it's real gray. Like, she's power hungry, among others, and like Bluefinger's even. You know, but I don't think any of them are written in a way. Also, the stakes are lower. Like, that's the other part of the story that I love, is that there are lower stakes, and so it feels like a more intimate conflict, which also feels well presented. So, yeah. But you're right. It isn't morally gray in the conventional ways. It's just a little bit grayer than most of our villains thus far. Grayer.
Okay.
Yeah. Most people will disagree with me. That's fine. But I love Crow. I love, oh my God, the entire system of the cannonballs too, and the way that Tress learns all of that as well throughout the series. Talk about like the science of this world and the way that the spores function. I know we talked a little bit about this at the top, but the way that is given to us in pieces over the course of the story is excellent.
Mm.
So I mentioned earlier that I wanted to bring this up, and that is a great lead-in for me to say, I think Brandon, he wrote this book for his wife, as he said, and he used the bride kind of as an inspiration. But I think the main reason we have this planet and the spore knowledge that we now have is you can now, in the Cosmere, in like modern era Cosmere, have basically a D&D adventuring party. Is because you can have the person that has like antique guns, and you have the cowboy, and you have the sword fighters, and you have the people that use magic to like bring their clothes to life. And now there's dragons, and you can now sail a sea as pirates with very dangerous magical terrain around you, or you can go to far off lands and big cities to do a whole bunch of different things. And so there's all of these things that he's brought together. And when I talk to people about like the Cosmere, I'm like, honestly, sometimes it feels like Brandon is writing this entire series as a means to an end of creating the thing that will replace D&D, where people will say, yeah, I'm a Nalthian spore eater whose father fought alongside some famous characters from the Cosmere. And this, you know, and then the game master, the world hopper who's playing the game for everybody is like, and we're taking our adventure on the Spore Sea, and we're starting in the sunlight sphere sea, where the spheres turn into fire when they get wet. And like, that's where it feels like it's all building with the knowledge and the way that it all came at us.
Mm-hmm. I think that also the fact that not all of the spores have been explicitly defined allows for, like, going off of that idea, allows for the game master to put their own touches on this planet and create unique spore types and mechanics. That'd be super, super cool to play within.
It also totally gives him the idea, like, it gives this foundation too that there's more to explore here yet, which isn't just like an idea of like more books potentially, but also is something that will be like, oh, there will be other spores, to the point of that we were talking about earlier, maintaining a sense of magic in the later stages of the Cosmere. I think that this is the way to do it, is keeping 7 of these under wraps still, potentially 8 with the secret spore, of which I'm fairly confident that it's white sand, right? Do we all think that it's white sand? Are we pretty sure that white sand might be the Aether, the secret Aether? I think it might be. PJ, I know you haven't read it, but white sand is a strange. I don't. It's weirdly canon and weirdly not canon, is the way that Brandon keeps saying. Like, it is canon, but like they're rewriting it. So I don't know. I don't feel bad about that one versus Stormlight. So
yeah, I think you're 100% right. That white sand is the last Aether.
Seemingly, yeah.
Do you think there's actually 16 of them
instead of 13? I don't know.
Interesting. 13 would be a very weird number for Brandon to use, even considering the Aethers predate the shattering of Adonalsium. It would be very weird for him to have 13. So.
Yeah. Unless that's something connected with the Aethers and like them being, I don't know. Unless there is some like prime Aether being, that was maybe in conjunction with Adonalsium. I don't know. There's a bunch of good. We're not going to know for a while. I was mentioning something, and you definitely pointed out when I was talking about the books, right, and the story on the world, kind of connecting to the point about the D&D. Do you think that there will be more books? That kind of seemed to be the way that your eyes shot up when I said that. So,
I think like when he wrote his sci-fi series, the Skyward series, he brought in J.S.C. Patterson to write the novellas, and now he's brought in Dan Wells to be part of the narrative to write more the Cosmere cosmic horror stuff. It would not surprise me if he has another author in the wings who has kind of that Terry Pratchett writing style, who he wants to install in this kind of world. Maybe not, but I'd be even if it's a few years away, I would expect there to be, like, even if it's 5 or 6 years away, I would expect there to be a sequel of some kind, because the knowledge that Tress gains is so massive, and the amount of character development she has is so large that for her to not have a continued story seemed almost offensive to that. So I really hope there's another story.
Yeah. I'm with you. I love that. PJ, what do you think? I'm not sure. I'd love for there to be more. I want for there to be more. But I could see this being just a fun standalone story that gets passed around. Potentially one that's not even entirely factual, like could be majorly made up by Hoyd. I don't like that idea, but I could see it happening. I don't know. Liar sometimes.
And Brandon's favorite literary trope is an unreliable narrator. So, dang it.
Yes, definitely the case. I think that's also, I know that on the other side, on the metatext side of this, right, Brandon's doing this in part because he is going to eventually have to go back and write the Dragonsteel books. And so those are all going to be narrated from Hoyd. And so he is kind of using some of these stories as practice to get there, and is going to be writing more to nail down that voice so that we can talk about the foundation of the universe, as it were, in the Dragonsteel series and what happened precisely, and kind of break that down. But, I think that this is interesting as an exercise in sort of that thing, especially because Hoyd is a little bit, I wouldn't say he's like fully unreliable, but he's not fully reliable either. Like, there's definitely some questions of like how far things stretch in which directions. And yeah, so I'm intrigued by what this means for the future storytelling in other related adventures.
Yeah.
I'm also curious, just based on this being told by Hoyd. We talked a little bit about the placement where this is within the Cosmere, but this story is well before this telling, because he talks about how, I think, Ford is writing out all the stupid things that he says, and he says that he's going to hold it over his head for decades, and then he's like, he did. So like, this is decades after the telling, or after the story happens.
Wow. Fair point. Yeah. So not only, why didn't I think of that? Good work.
Good work.
Yeah. That it has to be, right? So not only is this deeper in the timeline than we've been, but he's also recanting it to someone. So the meta narrative of whoever is being told this is even later in the worlds.
Now all I want, now that you said that, I just want Tress and her crew to be like a Treasure Planet world hopping pirate crew, where they just reign
that'd be fucking awesome
throughout the universe.
That'd
be so cool.
Bringing kindness and spores everywhere.
Yeah. Like nope, I was going to spoil something. Never mind.
I know where you were going again. It's that one novella, but yeah, no, I feel you. I know exactly what you're saying, but yeah, I agree with you. I think that it would be delightful to see more. I feel like the answer to the question of will we see a sequel in this realm, I think we might see one that involves the planet. I don't know that we'll see another Tress story to any degree. I assume that we're not done with Lumar as a world, but I assume that we are done with Tress, unless she's maybe a footnote and other things and just mentioned. But
yeah.
Maybe she becomes a
fair.
character. Like if somebody lands on this world and needs passage on a pirate ship and she's helming it, something like that.
Or they reference her like in Era 2 when they reference Ellen and Ben. You know, people reference Tress as like just some mythological figure almost.
Right. I realize so clearly that we've missed Huck almost entirely inside of this conversation. And the whole like core of the story to some degree being the curses, the mythical rat can't, talk and whatnot. But yeah, I want to talk about the curses. I want to talk about Huck. I want to talk about the central conceit of this. How somehow we've talked about everything else, but we haven't talked about the story itself. Like the primary leading force, which is these curses. It's Huck, it's love. What do we think about the rat? When did you guys key into the rat being Charlie?
I think when he started talking about his family. It was pretty early on, but when he was kind of dodgy about it, and he's like, I come from a family of talking, or of people who can talk. That's where it started really kind of like, okay, there's something up here. And that's when I started to kind of have suspicions about it.
I think for me, it was Hoyd says, maybe the thing that she had been searching for the entire time was with her all along. And then I was like, yeah.
Yeah, you're not talking about some internal growth. You're talking about that little mouse right there, aren't you? God, you Hoyd. All right. Little jerk.
What about you, Kross?
So we were running a thread on this inside of our Discord for patrons, and so I was kind of like live annotating my thoughts. I know that I sent the message at chapter 20 along the lines of like, if Huck is not Charlie, I will eat a hat, I believe is literally what I said. Because I was just so on that train. I don't know where that is in relatively in the story comparatively now. Like I can't remember when that was, but I just remember being like, man, I love how tropey the story is, but if the rat isn't Charlie, I'm gonna be a little concerned. Now, did I think that it was the curse? Did I have all the rest of the story worked out? Not at all, which is why it was still like a dream storytelling moment. And the way that kind of flipped on its head, being like the intent was to bring her there, and that was his part of the curse. And oh God, heart-wrenching. They have to force to bring that. It's just damn.
Yeah, that was rough.
Yeah.
I started listening to this again yesterday, and upon like rereading it, I don't know if you have you read this multiple times, Peter?
I didn't have time.
Yeah.
You have? Okay. So the point where Huck is introduced, where she's in that cellar or in the brig, essentially, that to me, upon rereading, almost felt disingenuous. And I don't know if that's the right term to use, but it felt like there was so much misdirection happening, and it wasn't on his part. It felt like he was genuinely surprised that she wasn't actually an inspector, or wasn't like on that ship on purpose to like catch them pirating. And it pretty quickly turns, but that first scene with him felt like he wasn't trying to. It felt like it wasn't Charlie, I guess.
Yeah. I think now that you say that, I hadn't really thought about that, but I wonder if, it could be 10 different things, but I wonder if maybe not talking for, a year or however long he'd been gone. Yeah, I think it'd been a year since she had received the cup. So like being a rat for almost a year, not talking and just being so caught off guard. Like imagine like the love of your life is just suddenly in prison next to you and you can't tell them that they're your love. Like that would throw me in my head, it probably threw him off, but yeah, it was a little sketchy, very different from the Charlie for the rest of the book.
Right.
The other side of that, I think, to me, in my impression, and again, I haven't gone back and reread it, but just with the context of the ending in mind, he's kind of pushing back against her in Hostile, probably because he doesn't want to take her there. Like, in the end, it's the curse that's kind of fueling him to be like, he doesn't need to be or represent that thing, and he's trying to like push against it maybe at first because he is so shocked that she's there. And it's like, no, I can't imagine this being the reality, is that I have to take you. Oh God. Like,
Yeah.
So I see it, I guess, but again, that's in concept, not in actuality, because I haven't reread it. So that's just running on the curse concept. But what about Hoyd's curse and like the gamble there, basically?
Oh no, that's a spoiler.
Hoyd is the most spoilerific character that exists, so I understand.
It was cool to see Hoyd lose for 3/4 of a book, because I am used to him kind of being someone in control most of the time. And so to see him not in control, and for 2 years, which that shocked me when Ulam was like, yeah, he's been like this for 2 years. I was like, oh man, that's a long time for our boy Hoyd.
Yeah. Our boy Hoyd, for sure. And I love Hoyd. I love that bit of the story. And I love that this is finally him, because if we recall, of course, at the end of Elantris with the prologue that was added at the anniversary point, this is him finally figuring out how to become an Elantrian basically through this bet, right? Like, now he's got access to the Elantrian magic through this bet. And he's been prevented from having that for theoretically so long in the story. That is so fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, based on like general Cosmere timeline and where we are now, at least 100 years. No,
it's got to be thousands, I think.
It's got to be at least 700 years.
Yeah.
Based on when stories happen. That's a long time, as a minimum amount of time, to have not gotten that. And I, like a lot of people, like in Reddits and Discourse and stuff, Elantrian magic is generally the most powerful if you have the knowledge and skill, but it's the hardest to learn out of all the magics.
Yeah, because unlike everything else, which is very sort of tangible and physically interacts with things, it's a language. So there's a lot of complexity. I imagine, similarly to the way that the curses function and other things like that, it is a series of symbols. So I imagine Elantrian magic closer to programming than most of the other magic systems, if that makes sense. Like, that's where my brain goes with it. But how do we feel about also the resolution to this and the fight with the sorceress really coming from Hoyd as opposed to it being a confrontation with Tress? Were we good with that?
It bothered me a little bit. But when Tress ordered Hoyd to do something, and she was like, well, you're part of my crew, aren't you? And he was like, all right. Like that, I was like, okay, that's a little receptive.
Yeah.
But it did bother me at first.
Yeah.
I can't imagine how Tress could have dealt with the sorceress on her own. Like that.
I think it would have been spore driven if it were going to be anything. You're right.
If anything, yeah. Would that have done anything though? You can get ingenious with things, I suppose. But
it's good.
No, go for it.
Oh, I was going to say, I think that like one of the tough things with this is it's like what she could have done is probably restrict hands. Like, I could imagine, like, basically bind her up so that she couldn't draw the symbols to begin with. That was my thought, is, you know, effectively the way that she's able to use some of these spores are similar to handcuffs. She isn't quite that deft with them, but we've seen her tie up characters before with well-timed, you know, crafted things. So I kind of imagine that being the resolution as opposed to what we get in the form of the Hoyd fight.
Yeah, I thought maybe she would use the Midnight Aether. I thought because her work with the vines and like communicating with them, part of me thought, oh, okay, she's going to get to the Midnight Sea and the monsters are just going to like bow to her whim because she's so like prepped and so like her intent or connection or whatever is so much stronger than the sorceress's. And then immediately, you know, Hoyd was like, she had 2 weeks of doing this, and so nope. And I was like, oh, there's my prediction.
Right. Yeah, that's totally fair. Yeah, and again, the story is like littered with a bunch of different connections too. We've mentioned and kind of skated around Ulam for a long time, and I don't know why, because comparatively, we know a shit ton about Mistborn. PJ, we've been talking about it for over a year now, and so I think it's great to have this Khandra on the boat and on the ship and in the crew. There's some interesting commentary around that, of course, and Sazed's also brought up, like we talked about earlier. So there's some comments there, but what do we think about Ulam? I know I just jumped from the conclusion of the book all the way back to like the doctor.
The one thing that I picked up on this sort of mostly read through, Ulam mentions that, so when they're talking about the familiars, and he says that his people are the source of those sort of myths on several other worlds.
That's so interesting that you brought that up, PJ. Yeah.
That's so weird. I don't know.
Yeah. Crazy.
I mean, I don't know if they have been established in Stormlight. I'm not going to ask you guys to answer or not, but at the very least, it's been a long time that since they've been allowed to leave Scadrial, so it's possible that they've taken root and gained sort of mythological origins on other worlds as well. But that's what I have to say about that. Because I don't know.
Without diving into the spoiler side of that side of the conversation, I think we can point to the Lost Metal and Milan basically taking a quest from Sazed to go and world hop, and this idea that maybe there's a lot more out there that have been doing exactly what you're saying. Right. It does seem to point in that direction.
Yeah, and because he says like since Sazed released them, right? That like because he's not pretending to be a human. He's just a Khandra. He is just like an oozy, goopy, growing extra body parts kind of guy.
Yeah.
Whose heart isn't beating and whose skin is cold, which is so different from where we leave off in the Lost Metal. So I want to know about that.
Yeah. I do want to clarify, he doesn't say Sazed released them. That is Hoyd that says that Sazed released them. But yeah, we're in Ulam in the scene, and like that's all, they're in the same room and whatnot. And there is this sort of metatextual question. This is the only thing that I talked to PJ about really with this book beforehand too much. But there's this context of Sazed releasing them. Do we think that is later in the eras, or do we feel like that's just the freedom that was given after Sazed became Harmony? Like there's some interesting, there's a question there, I guess. Because they had choices. They had choices to like end their own lives now. They could naturally decline versus like having full control.
I assumed it was talking about the point where Ulam leaves, which is before the Lost Metal, I think. At least they talk about it within the Lost Metal having already left.
Yeah, that he was on a mission, or that he was a mentor, I think, is the context there. I double-checked this before, but I love having a Kindle that I can search on.
Like chapter 10.
It is very early on. So it is Milan, and what she says is just not what it was to you. I know that I should have expected that. Tensoon warned me. Ulam warned me. Mortals see time differently. So it's not necessarily a full on. We don't know where Ulam is and sort of in the spectrum of things, but we do know he's out there. Or that he
That's what I was looking for.
Yeah.
We just looked that up. I was like, I know he's mentioned somewhere.
I'm going to double check Bands 2 real quick. Yeah, he's not.
I thought it mentioned him leaving at some point, but
I think doesn't she mention Ulam going off on a mission when she does? Am I wrong?
Oh, that could be.
I think she says something like those before that went. So like there's an assumption there. But the only time that Ulam is brought up in all 4 books of Era 2 is that in that one sentence.
Sneaky Brandon.
Yeah, sneaky. Just laying just enough. But it is kind of hinted at, of course. And I think that this story maybe confirms that. I think that it's a stretch in that direction of like he's probably a mentor or a close family member in some degree to her. And yeah, that's kind of how I picture it. But they, the line that Hoyd says, I swear they've all been getting weirder ever since Sazed released them. That's where it gets dicey, and I'm not sure if this is something that's extra textual, something that maybe happens between eras, Era 3. I don't know. So we were still talking about Ulam. I had to do a quick mic swap that happens from time to time when things go wrong. But we were talking a little bit more about Ulam and just sort of the context of the story. You know, where exactly they land with Sazed and sort of the disconnect there, maybe between eras, or what this all looks like. So just wanted to open that back up with thoughts on our Conjure boy.
Should I go with
fire away?
All right. There is a commentary in Bands of Mourning or the Lost Metal, whatever it is. I think Bands of Mourning is what we landed on, where Warren talks about their own faceless immortals and them notably having red eyes, which is how Ulam is described, but they're not glowing. So do we think this is the same type of Khandra that we're used to, or is there a possibility that this is whatever that sort of creature that Ed Warren was discussing could be?
Something that does seem off, that I think could line up with that, is that Ulam seems to accidentally do things that we haven't seen Khandra accidentally do. Like, he grows an extra pinky, and then he says, "Oh, that's interesting." Like, he didn't do it on purpose, which is not something we've seen a Khandra do. So I am curious if, like, he's different in some way. And the connection to red eyes, they're not glowing, but it does. I mean, we do know, as Kross, as you said during the break, he does steal eyes, and so, or take eyes from people. That is, maybe they're just someone else's eyes, but I don't know. And the more I think about it, PJ, the more I'm like,
there's one other question there. There's one other difference that he has one contemporary in it, and that is Pa'alm, but he only has one capital letter in his name, unlike almost all other Khandra.
Interesting. Wow.
Is that this is more of a general thing, right? I wonder if that is intentional in the way that you're assuming it is, right? In the fact that, like, it means that there is maybe down a spike or something like that. Like, the capitals are for each spike or something. That maybe, I guess, interesting, fascinating. Very weird meta text to put on that, though, because they're referring to Pa'alm this whole time. Like, both of these cases that we're talking about are double A's, so that's also
right.
I mean, it's a big question. I just don't know. I don't know that we'll have an answer for a long time, if at all.
I haven't looked at this, but I'm wondering if the naming conventions for the generations of Khandra are different.
Ooh.
And I wonder if Ulam and Pa'alm, like, are they from the same generation, or is Ulam from, like, the 6th or something? And so the naming type is different. So I'm curious about that.
I think we know Pa'alm is 7th. I feel like that's right. I feel like I remember that.
No, she's
Pa'alm. She's the first, because she's the Lord Ruler's.
Oh, really?
I think she's a third. I think she's
third.
She's of the third generation,
which is the same as Tensoon.
Yes,
and Ursur.
Pa'alm, Tensoon, Ulam. But no double capital. Interesting. Yeah. It's these tiny things. I did love, this is something we haven't said yet. Yeah. I did love how Brandon used Hoyd to make fun of his fans.
Oh my gosh.
Like, for those of you who are wondering, it's iron. Like, for those of you caring about weather patterns, it's this. Please get a different interest.
The shade thrown at meteorologists in general.
Oh, that was so funny. I love our Discord chart. Anytime anyone arrives to that line, our Discord, they would just post a picture of it and be like, "I feel personally attacked." And I just loved it.
I totally feel that. Like, I also loved that. And I remember I took some notes down as I was reading, not like a whole ton, but I was just like, here are some things. And it's in chapter 35 that it happens. And Crow has this whole wonderful speech about, like, a life not lived. And that kind of gives us this idea of her motivation before we really see that she is this corrupted form and why she's doing all of this. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful moment. But then shortly thereafter is the moment with Hoyd. And for me, it is simultaneously like the most aware that Sanderson is of what he's done and created and, like, the monsters that he's birthed. And it feels like the least aware, where he's, like, reaching, like, there's some, like, interesting balancing act of, like, I know you're all nerds, and you're acknowledging the fact that they're all nerds. So the fact that you're acknowledging it is also its own, it's its nice little bitter taste of irony, I think.
What's great is the rest of us can be like, hey, you're the one that made this.
Right, exactly.
You are the one that did 2 years of world building before even writing a book.
Yeah.
Like, come on.
Exactly. So that's where my brain went with it, for the record, was like, it is simultaneously like poking fun at those of us of whom are obsessing over these details. At the same time, if you didn't obsessively put the details in, we wouldn't obsess over them to the degree that we do. So, if you didn't do this, we wouldn't do it. So, yeah.
And it was also a clever way to include the information for us, because I'm sure there were people who were like, what is that? What is that metal? I need to know. And then he says it, without it having to be an in-world conversation that Tress has. So it doesn't feel like as much of a lore dump, but it lands as a joke that's also a lore dump, which is clever.
That's also just a benefit of the storytelling vehicle of Hoyd throughout the story, is that any of the moments that feel like lore dumps aren't, because it feels like you're being told the story as opposed to being told the story by some off-screen, non-existent narrator in the head of a POV character as previous. So like it works brilliantly in part because of their narration and giving this from Hoyd's perspective. One character's journalistic breakdowns in a book of Stormlight, for instance, by comparison of which feels very info dumpy versus
yeah, I agree.
Anyway, as a comparison point. Yeah, God, so good. You had something that you wanted to bring up, Peter, in relation to another curiosity in the story.
Yeah, so for me, there's really like 3 things in this story that are kind of like the whole Cosmere effective. 1 is the Aethers. 2 is the release of the Khandra by Sazed. And 3 is from chapter 61, and I'll just read it here. The fake Charlie had walked up to the doorway, and the light weaving had fallen away, revealing a creature that only resembled a human, reptilian, with golden eyes and a toothy grin. We have no idea what that is. Like, we have zero knowledge of any sort of reptilian humanoid in this universe. For it to be dropped in like the middle of a high pressure situation where you could easily flip past that and like just scan and miss it. As I had 2 people in our Discord chat miss that entire moment. I reached out to one of the Reddit mods, Joff Wu, and I was like, do you have any idea? And he was like, I have 0. I have no clue what this is. And so that for me is like, that's like the tidbit that like now, like, okay, this is going to come up in another world and it'll be a throwback to Tress 7 books from now when we learn about the reptilian people.
Yeah.
I just kind of assumed that it was one of the Midnight Ether creatures or something like that. Like I hadn't.
It's closer to like warging, you know what I mean? Like it's very similar in most fantasy contexts to like going into another spirit, like interchange or like another body basically, and living through them. So I don't feel like she could probably balance both of those. So I think I'm with you on the idea of this being just something else. And I think the golden eyes and a toothy grin, it just gives me this idea that if Rena picked it up somewhere along the lines and like has this thing around. Are there more of them? Is there something else? Where do they come from?
So I just looked up on the Coppermind. So we know of several dragons in the Cosmere. In each instance of dragon, they have the ability to give boons. So that seems like a type of magic they have. And we learned that from Zixis. But they can also shapeshift into people, which is something I wasn't certain of. But that's what the Coppermind said. So I'm wondering if that dragon person is like a half dragon.
Or dragon form, or a human form of a dragon.
Yeah, a dragonborn from D&D, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, I totally spaced out while you were talking. I'm very sorry. My brain...
There's a lot of speculation, right, around this. And I wonder if it is. To me, I think I like the mystery of that not being the solution, although it could be, if that makes sense. Like that's where my line feels pulled from. I have to think in my head, or at the very least, the way that I picture this, I feel like this is going, especially the way that this character is depicted, I think it's going to be a character that Dan Wells is going to end up writing. It's going to be from something else adjacent, something horror driven. You'd have a reptilian species on a planet, perhaps. Yeah, I don't know. I'm into it.
Mm-hmm. I know this is way off topic, but you mentioned Dan Wells and horror writing. Yep. So I want to know, like, what is a story you're hoping to hear from Dan Wells in a Cosmere with his ability to write horror?
That's great. So I know that PJ hasn't read. I gave PJ the open berth to read all of the novellas before we read The Lost Metal. I was like, read whatever you'd like. He read none of them, none of the ones that we hadn't read yet. So I feel like the answer that I would give is something related to like Sixth of Dusk-esque, or like that an earlier time frame on that world. And I also I kind of get the feeling that we're also just going to see this as a palette for new worlds. But yeah, because I think that Brandon's going to like kind of retain most of his prime worlds that are there, of course. I mean, Mistborn, he said that he'll give Isaac Stewart a story when he's good for it, or when he wants, to have like a side novel or stuff like that. But yeah, I don't know. The type of story that I want to see is definitely more grounded stories like this that aren't the end of the world all the time, and more like solo focused. And I think that's what horror is so good at capturing, is like the sort of moments with one person, and like, or a small group of people. And so I think that Dan Wells' stories will be smaller in scope, higher in personal stakes. That's kind of what I expect. I don't know worlds. I can't think of, outside of Six of Dusk, I can't think of another. Secrets in the
Shadows for Silence.
Yeah. Also that one. Yeah. Those are the two. Yeah.
I'm kind of like, I've read his I'm Not a Serial Killer, and then the second one as well, which I really enjoyed, but full disclosure, if they gave me nightmares, I'd stop reading them. But I would love, because I know a lot of people are kind of bummed about the end of Wax and Wayne, because the characters are so lovable. And part of me hopes that we get like a story of Wax and Wayne in the Rux, written by Dan Wells, where they're going after like the horrific evil people that Dan Wells could write so well. Which I think that would be cool.
Yeah, some filler stories I think are great. And I also think that's the benefit of like Isaac Stewart stepping in as well for some of those too, when eventually that happens, is that I think that playing with those characters and tones in different ways will be very, very interesting. And they're kind of the ones that I think will fill in the fun sections, while Brandon takes care of the really big, expansive stories. And that'll make it feel, to me, like more of a universe, which I think is also the void, to pull it back, because that's what I'm doing now. That's the void that like this story fills, right? This is a small personal story, and that's why it rules, and that's why it's so good. Is it's not the end of the world. It's just a tale of love. It's the Princess Bride, but on a crazy cool planet with hexagonal seas, and that's great.
And I love the ending. I love that the ending is she saves her town from poverty, and she sails the seas with her crew and her love, and that they just kind of keep going. And I just every Cosmere novel has some sort of ending that is like, oh my God, that's stressful. Now I have to read the next one. And this one is like, here's a nice bow. Everything's done. And for those of you that need little tidbits, this ancient sorceress flies off in a rocket ship, and there's a reptilian person. Everything else tied up in a bow. And I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes it enjoyable on its own merit too, I think, is the other part of that. Like a lot of the Cosmere can just feel like it just spans forever, and like we're waiting for some kind of a resolution on a lot of things, and we won't have one in some cases for a very long time. So it's just, it's nice to have some catharsis of an actual ending, which is why I kind of hope that there isn't a sequel that focuses on Tress. I hope that it's just this isolated thing, but more of the story, like more of Lumar, I'm down for.
I like that. That's actually a really good point, and I like that.
Yeah. PJ, thoughts?
I think I'm in agreement with you. I love this planet. I love everything that's been outlined for it. There's something to be said about a small story. One that doesn't have dire world-ending consequences. One that's enjoyable in its own right and doesn't need to be bleeding out into the rest of the Cosmere. It doesn't have to have the ripple effects. But you still get the benefit of all the extra information that's being used within that story.
Which is interesting because that's what he was originally writing. Talked about in the Elantris forward, maybe, or maybe an episode of Writing Excuses, how he used to just write stories that were just human stories in magical places. And then he had a publisher or a friend say, the world needs to be in peril, Brandon. You can't write fantasy stories without the world being in peril. And then he did in this one, finally, after like 20 years of publishing fantasy books. He writes a book where the world is not in peril. Someone is just in love and they have to save their love. And I love that. I love that for Brandon, that he got to do something he's been trying to do since he started writing. And I love that it does just encapsulate, it's a whole story on its own. And I love that.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with you guys. You swayed me. I don't need a sequel. It's perfect.
We swung it at the last minute. That's our job. That's our gig. Well, sweet. I think that's a great place to end, unless you have anything else, Peter, to append, of course, if there's anything else on your plate. God, I love this. I love this book. And I think that's my net, right? I when I read it, I was like, this is a 9.5 out of 10. And by the conclusion, it was like, okay, it's an 8.5. It was really good. Like the tech bungled me a little bit, but man, it's still a delightful story and an easy top 5, I think, Sanderson read. Definitely where I'd recommend everyone start. I think that this is like my new recommended starting point to some degree for a lot of new readers, young readers, which is weird because it's all in the time.
Yeah.
But
my mom is 67 and is halfway through this book, and it's her first Cosmere book. And so I'm excited to kind of see what she says, because I think it's going to be start here. Start with this one before going into the rest of the Cosmere.
Yeah.
Once I get my physical copy, I'm giving it immediately to my fiance to read. So.
Love it. I love that the main characters are in love with each other. That's one of the most adorable puns that Brandon has written.
Yeah. And it feels, I know that we were like, oh, we'll end, but I'm so with you on that, like, because it does actually feel like a real love. And it's not that like Ellen and Vin, for instance, don't at any point, but it is so much more personal, low standard. The writing, because of being told from Hoyd's perspective, has this romanticism to it all. Ugh. Adorable.
100%.
Yeah. It's an adorable little book. I love it. Well, cool. Thank you again so much, Peter, for coming on to the show and doing this. Can people find you on the internet as we did before we met?
I'm on TikTok and Instagram. Sometimes I go on Reddit. On Reddit, my username is Praying for Superpower. It was my podcast from like 5 years ago. So I have a few old YouTube videos up. I haven't made anything new in quite some time. But my new stuff and a lot of Cosmere memes you can find on TikTok at Cosmere Considered.
Sweet. Awesome. Yeah. I highly recommend, obviously. We're so glad to have you on the show. Yeah. Hell yeah.
Yeah,
we'll do another one of these for sure.
Yeah. Hey, I would love, if you want to bring me back for each of the secret projects, I'd love that.
Yeah. I'm very, very excited to do more of these. And I think that there's another one down the road for sure. And, you know, we originally, before thinking and realizing that we were going to need someone on for a secret project, we were going to do the Emperor's Soul. So perhaps we do that sooner than later. So
the Emperor's Soul is my it's my go-to when I say, like, when someone says what's your favorite, I usually say the Emperor's Soul. So I would love to come in for that.
Yeah. It's short. It's good. It's punchy. I love it. Cool. All right. Well, thanks again for coming onto the show, and thank you all so much for listening to our show.
Be sure to check us out on Instagram, Reddit, Twitter, wherever. You can join our Patreon, patreon.com/wordsandwhiskey. We're at Words Whiskey Pod on most things. wordsandwhiskeyshow@gmail.com if you've got any spicy takes or just messages for us. Yeah, that's where you can find us. As mentioned, Instagram, TikTok for Peter and Cosmere Considered. And next month, I think we're talking about The Thief of Always. Is that correct?
Yes. Next month, we're going to be talking about Clive Barker's The Thief of Always, of which is my favorite book of all time. So I'm I'm freaking out a little bit about just the concept of covering it. For those of whom are unaware, because it is not an overly popular book, it is a fable. It is a sort of kid's fable. It's very approachable. It's got just enough horror in it to be really fascinating and really great, but not too much to be too scary for children. And so it is my favorite story. I have a lot more to say, but I don't want to color it too much for PJ. And I'm very excited to talk about it. I think we're literally doing that this weekend on Sunday. So, but yeah, very, very excited. Coming out on my birthday, so February 15th, as a little birthday present to me.
Happy birthday.
So yeah, as PJ had mentioned, you can find us at all those places, and we'll see you next month.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.